So what type of sins or errors did Israel do to make God allow them to lose? I say that there are three. Errors in the Bible, or more specifically, Bible contradictions. Type that in Google and the first site you'll come across to is from American Atheists. On their site, they state, if written by a perfect being, then it must not contradict itself, as a collection of books written by different men at different times over many centuries will be expected to contradict each other. They list their contradictions to be the Sabbath day, the permanence of earth, seeing God, human sacrifice, the power of God, personal injury, circumcision, incest, trusting God, the holy lifestyle, punishing crime, temptation, family relationship, the resurrection of the dead, and the end of the world. If you've been counting, that's 15 contradictions listed. I'm not here trying to say that the Bible is perfect. I want to know if these supposed mistakes really show that the Bible is wrong. I looked into this a lot. This is like my third time going over this, but I really want to hear from you. Please share your ideas and arguments in the comment section. Let's talk about it. That's all I got for an opening. Now the Lord was with Judah, and they took possession of the hill country, but they could not drive out the inhabitants of the valley because they had iron chariots. Judges chapter 1 verse 19. And looking at them, Jesus said to them, with people this is impossible, but with God all things are possible. Matthew chapter 19 verse 26. Matthew chapter 19 verse 26 isn't the only verse in the Bible that claims that God can do anything and everything without limits. You got Genesis 18 chapter 14, Job chapter 42 verse 2, Ephesians chapter 3 verse 20, Mark chapter 10 verse 27, and Luke chapter 1 verse 37. While on the other hand, Judges chapter 1 verse 19 seems to indicate that there are limits to God's power. How can an all-powerful God be limited by iron chariots? But before looking at just one verse, we should look at the whole context of the chapter. To understand the context better, let's start in chapter 28 of Deuteronomy. From the very beginning of the chapter until the 14th verse, we see that the Lord promises blessings for obedience from the Israelites. Verse 1 and 2 reads, And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments, which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come on thee, and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. However, if you continue to read from verse 15 to the end of the chapter, the Lord outlines dire warnings and consequences for disobedience, with verse 15 stating, But it shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all his commandments and his statutes, which I commanded thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. This chapter lays the foundation for a clear principle. Obedience leads to blessings, while disobedience brings curses. In a way, it also reflects parenthood. A loving parent will reward good behavior and disciplines when necessary, not out of cruelty, but out of a desire for their child's well-being. Similarly, God, as a divine parent, offers guidance, blessings, and warnings to guide his people toward the path of righteousness. This right here should be the framework of what appears to be Israel's failures in Judges chapter 1 verse 19. So what type of sins or errors did Israel do to make God allow them to lose? I say that there are three.
Strike.
The book of Judges start on a triumphant note. We're told that the Lord has delivered the land of the Canaanites and Perizzites until Judah. But things start to take a dark turn when Adonai-Bezek, the Canaanite king, tried to escape. What followed wasn't an act of some divine justice. Instead, the Israelites chose to mutilate him by cutting off his thumbs and big toes. The Israelites thought it was a fair thing to do. Even Adonai-Bezek believed it was a fair thing to do before he dies, stating, 70 kings with their thumbs and their big toes cut off used to gather up scraps at my table, as I have done, so God has repaid me. But there was no command of God to perform such act. Interestingly, when reading scriptures like Exodus chapter 29 verse 20 and Leviticus chapter 8 from verses 23 to 24, the right thumb and toes were symbols used in priestly anointings. By mimicking Adonai-Bezek's cruel practices, the Israelites probably were attempting a twisted form of this ritual. This act was more aligned with the cruel customs of surrounding nations than God's expectations. Imagine a scenario where a police officer, instead of upholding justice, adopts the violent methods of criminals. That's akin to what the Israelites did here. While Adonai-Bezek might have seen poetic justice in his fate, we're left the question, did God approve? By adopting the cruel traditions of their enemies, the Israelites displayed an early inclination toward straying from the righteous path that God has set for them. Just because the Bible details an event doesn't mean it's prescribed for others to follow. It's just recording a historical event. The Israelites weren't just adapting to the cruel practices of their adversaries. They were also succumbing to cultural pressures. In verse 12 of Judges chapter 1, Caleb, who can be seen as a national hero, makes a public declaration. He promised his daughter, Akshar, to the man who captured the city of Debir. The victor, Othniel, who happens to be Caleb's nephew. While there isn't a direct command between cousins, there are plenty of instances in the chapter where the Lord mentions don't have sex with them because they are close relatives. I'm pretty sure cousins are close relatives. Yet, the Israelites, as God's chosen people, were held to a different standard. They were called to be distinct, to be set apart. Now, there were certain scenarios where God allowed this to persist, but before the command given on Mount Sinai. I should have the older video, the new video up here, or in the link to address it. The third strike against Israel is rooted in the land itself and the nations that reside in it. Judges chapter 1 verse 16 states, Now the descendants of Kenite, Moses' father-in-law, went up from the city of the palms with the sons of Judah to the wilderness of Judah, which is in the south of Arad, and they went and lived with the people. These people were very likely the Amalekites. Verses from 1 Samuel chapter 15 and Numbers chapter 13 verse 29 serve as breadcrumbs, tracing the presence of the Amalekites in the Negev region. But here's the problem. God had given a specific mandate to Israel regarding the Amalekites. In Deuteronomy chapter 25, from verses 17 to 19, they were to be utterly removed from the land. However, as history unfolded, Israel did not uphold this mandate. The Amalekites persisted, and even during the reign of King Saul, showcasing Israel's constant failure to heed God's commands. To further complicate matters, the descendants of the Canaanite moved into the region, cohabitating with the very nations that God had directed Israel to displace. It wasn't just a failure of duty, it was like rubbing salt into a wound. And there it was, the third and final strike against Israel. By the point we reach Judges chapter 1 verse 19, Israel's journey is marred with moments of disobedience. 3 significant instances already spotlight their repeated failure to follow the Lord's commands. It's essential to remember, while God's grace is boundless, it doesn't guarantee immunity from the consequences of disobedience. God's promise to the Israelites was clear. Blessings would shower those who follow his commands, while a shadow of curse would be cast upon those who strayed. This relationship wasn't to be undermined. God kept to his word, while Israel did not. Just as a parent desires the best for their child, but won't shield them from every consequence, God persisting with Israel didn't mean they win every battle or cross every hurdle in retrospective of their actions. Fast forward to Judges chapter 2 from verses 2 to 3. Here, God's disappointment with Israel is obvious. He reminds them of his clear directive. You shall not make a covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars. Yet, Israel's failure to comply leads to solemn pronouncement. I will not drive them out from you, but they will become like thorns in your sides, and their gods will be a snare to you. This isn't some whimsical curse, but a natural outcome. By not driving out the inhabitants and allowing their altars to remain, Israel was setting themselves up for future temptations and challenges. Like thorns slowly embedding in one's flesh, these inhabitants and their gods would slowly become a pain and nuisance for Israel in later generations. Now, the power of God. The narrative of Judges chapter 1 verse 19 and the surrounding verses serve as a timeless lesson. God wasn't powerless to do nothing against the iron chariots, but fulfilling his end of the bargain with Israel. Obedience leads to blessings, while disobedience leads to punishments according to the Lord.